Welcome students to the notes Revolution in Europe and North America. We will look at some absolute monarchs that will lead to this revolution that will take place in Europe, specifically in England, and then spill over into North America with the American Revolution. Let's begin. Revolution in Europe and North America. Absolutism. You don't need to write down anything that is italicized. But following the Middle Ages, European monarchs became more powerful. I would like you to write this down. Rulers established themselves as absolute monarchs according to this divine right. That word divine means God. So there's kind of this God-given right, so to speak. And so after the Middle Ages, you're going to have these monarchs, these kings, that are going to feel like they have this authority from God to be strong rulers. Monarchs are going to be backed by nobles to support business. And so you're going to have not only the church, but also nobles and the merchants that are going to support these monarchs to be very strong. The church authority starts to get weakened, however, as the kings or monarchs' power increased to regulate the church. In previous times, the church had authority over the king, and anytime the king wanted to go to war, they would get support from the church. The church was that had most of the money. But now that relationship is going to change a little bit in that the church is going to bow to the king's authority. You don't need to write this down, but absolute monarchs start to regulate religious worships to assemblies. Bureaucracies are created to secure the economy. Bureaucracy means departmental government, and so these absolute monarchs are going to create different departments to help out their own economy. Absolute monarchs are going to maintain unquestioned power. So let's look at some examples. We have Philip II. The Philip II of Spain, he'll actually inherit Spain, the Netherlands, and the American colonies. And so he'll be the first example of an absolute monarch. He will seize Portuguese kingdom in 1580. Also, the wealth from the Americans starts to increase his power. As you can see in the shaded area, you have the different Spanish colonies there in North America. He would be a devout Catholic and push for war against the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims, and also Protestants. And so, being a Roman Catholic, he is going to fight Muslims as well as Protestants that had previously broken from the Catholic Church. He's going to defeat the Ottomans. You don't need to write down the name of the battle. In 1571. He will also create that famous Spanish Armada Navy to attack England, because remember, England had become Protestant, and so he's fighting these religious wars, so to speak. And in 1588, he launches those ships. However, a big storm would wipe out most of his fleet as they start to invade England, and England would be saved from becoming under Spanish domination. After the golden age of the Spanish Empire, they're going to start to be weakened due to inflation, high taxes, and also revolt. And so the Spanish golden age under Philip II would not last forever. Then we get to France with Louis XIV, probably the most famous of the absolute monarchs. He's going to come to power in France in 1643. He's the one that states that he is the state or the sun god. He's going to weaken the power of the nobles' authority. He's going to keep officials close to him, and he builds that famous Palace of Versailles in France so that he can constantly keep his watch over the different officials that are engaging in politics. And he really starts to weaken that power of the nobles that originally had helped build these absolute monarchs, but then their power starts to be taken away, the nobility power. By 1660, France was most powerful country in Europe. So Louis the 14th really developed this strong French presence in Europe. Constant warring, however, eventually would weaken France and Louis the 14th. So he kind of became too prideful and thought that he could do too much. And so this Sun King, as he called himself, would die in 1715. But he would be a model of absolute rule, which would not end with him. In Russia, we also have the example of Peter the Great. Peter the Great increased the power of the Russian Tsar. That term Tsar comes from the Latin word Caesar, or ruler. He attempted to westernize Russia. And so Russia is in the east, but he wants to make Russia more like the West. And so he's going to model himself after these absolute monarchs. Peter reduced the power of the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and also the landowners. So just as the other absolute monarchs start to reduce the power of those who create their power, they're going to turn, so to speak, on those who gave them their power. Peter left a modernized army in Russia, and so he will be the first one to really create that modern army. Mining becomes key to Russia, and the economy starts to improve a lot with the gems and other resources that they start to mine. St. Petersburg was built as a window on Europe. And so he really wants to be a European king, though he is in Russia, which is a little bit more eastern. And so he builds this very famous palace to be that window on Europe. Russia became a powerful country to compete with Europe. You don't need to write that down, though. It's italicized. Then we get to England. We have James I. By the 1500s, Parliament approved taxes, passed laws, advised monarchs. So it was really Parliament that did most of the governing. Parliament is like America's Congress in the United States currently. These monarchs maintained overall control, summoned and dismissed Parliament. And so James is going to basically have total control and dismiss Parliament from doing their previous reported jobs. James I is imposed divine right of kings. And so he's going to model himself after these other absolute monarchs. He's going to persecute the Puritans, who were wealthy merchants of Parliament. And so the Reformation had already taken place. The Anglican religion had started to develop, but England was not sure if they were going to become totally Protestant. And so he'll actually start to persecute these Puritans that want to purify his Anglican church. And he actually has the 1611 King James Bible compiled, translated into English, because he wants total authority over any dissenters to his power. He's going to spend very lavishly, which means he's going to spend without any type of recourse or thought to how much he's spending. So without worries about debts from the Catholic Wars, he's just going to spend a lot. He's going to circumvent Parliament, which means to go behind Parliament. And he called for feudal fines and duties. And so he will start to um, kind of go turn the clock back to kind of more old school, Dark Ages, feudal fines, and become very, very unpopular with the people due to his absolutism. His son Charles I is going to follow his example. Charles I is forced to sign the Petition of Right, however. Charles I ignored that Petition of Right, so Parliament is trying to get Charles I to listen to them and for them to advise the king, but he's really going to ignore them. The Scots resisted attempt to impose the Anglican Church, and so Charles I is going to try to force the Anglican Church on the Scots. However, their Presbyterian church with John Knox is going to resist that attempt there. So Parliament will meet to resist Charles I, known as the Long Parliament. And this leads to the English Civil War, Roundheads versus the Cavaliers. Oliver Cromwell rises as a leader and leads this new modern army. His Roundheads will start to resist the Cavaliers, which are the Charles I. The Roundheads would defeat Charles I's army, and Charles I is beheaded. This is the first time in modern times that a king has been beheaded by his people. And so this age of revolution will start off with this English Civil War. Oliver Cromwell will be the leader, known as Cromwell the Protector, will be the people's man as a military ruler. However, unfortunately, Cromwell initially establishes a republic with Parliament ruling. However, over time, he eventually becomes the Lord Protector as a military dictator. And so Cromwell becomes the dictator that he had sworn to defeat. And so, with Charles I's death and beheading, Cromwell now becomes the new absolute ruler. He established a strict Puritan rule, and so there's not going to be a freedom of religion, but the English society, English religion is going to be very strict Puritan. So after Cromwell would die, people sought to restore the monarchy. So now we have the Glorious Revolution. So that was the English Civil War. Now we have the Glorious Revolution. Charles II will be restored to the monarchy. People start to realize that Oliver Cromwell, his military dictatorship was not a good thing, and so they'll resort to a monarchy, a kingship. Charles II was careful in dealing with Parliament, but supported the Roman Catholic Church, and so this government support of religion would become an issue in England. However, he's very careful in dealing with Parliament. He does not want to lose his head like his father had. Parliament passed a Test Act to assure only Anglicans in office. So you start to see that Parliament and Charles II, the king, would start to be at odds with one another. Parliament wants to be more Anglican, Protestant, Church of England, whereas Charles wants to go back to the Roman Catholic Church way of doing things. He supports Louis XIV and France and their Roman Catholicism there in France. So in Parliament, you'll start to have the Tories versus the Whigs start to develop. When it comes to American Revolution, the Tories will be those who support the king, and the Whigs will be those who support the colonial rights. And so the Tories support the king, whereas the Whigs support the people, Parliament, Anglican, and such. So Charles II, heir, James II, posed a threat. Parliament invited William and Mary of Orange to rule in the Glorious Revolution. You know, the picture of them right there. So the people of Parliament, they start to not like Charles II and his Catholic ways, and so they get Mary and William to basically become the new king and queen. This forces Charles II to abdicate the throne or to leave the throne because he does not want to lose his head as Charles I had lost his head. So what is the legacy of the Glorious Revolution? Well, this bloodless revolution where nobody died because Charles II, he realized he didn't want to lose his head. We have a limited monarchy, okay, which means that the king is not in control, but it's going to be Parliament. Habeas corpus, which means the rights of the accused, that there's rights that criminals have to a fair trial. Also, you're going to have the English Bill of Rights, constitutional monarchy, which means that the king has to listen to the Constitution, eventual cabinet system with prime minister. And so the Glorious Revolution will really set up what what England's government is today, which will later inspire the American colonists to do the same thing, but even more with their Bill of Rights. The American Revolution. You don't need to write most of this down as this is more American history, but I just want you to remember that the American Revolution was inspired by the Glorious Revolution. 7 Years' War had drained the British treasury. The Britain began to enforce laws of regulation trade, such as the Navigation Acts, because of the 7 Years' War. It would be good to write down that British Parliament started to pass new taxes, though, on the Americans to pay for protection. And so the Parliament would start to pass these laws in England for the Americans, and so the Americans would feel like they are not being represented due to these taxes. And so the Sons of Liberty and other protest groups will start to violently suppress the tax collectors. The American colonists start to unite through self-government. So Britain believed that they had represented America in Parliament, but it was the king that had virtually chosen who was going to represent the Americans in Parliament. The Americans wanted to actually be represented. They wanted somebody who was from America to vote in Parliament for the American colonies. But the king had appointed who was going to be representing the Americans, and they didn't like that. The British soldiers are going to be stationed to protect, but the Boston Massacre will happen as a result of these British troops being stationed there. Revolutionary pamphlets such as Thomas Paine will start to spread more Enlightenment ideas, such as with John Locke, these natural rights ideas. The Tea Act was passed to help the East Indian Tea Company, but resulted in the Boston Tea Party, that famous event where the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans to dump the tea overboard so that the Americans would not be tempted to buy British products. So the First Continental Congress was established under George Washington to lead the Continental Army, the famous crossing of the Delaware River. The Declaration of Independence declared to Britain and the world that America was separate. American colonists, even though they were outmanned and outnumbered and out-resourced, they were able to defeat the British. The Battle of Saratoga was really that turning point where that gained the French as an ally. American forces would defeat the British at the Battle of Yorktown with the help of the French. And it's not just the French numbers that help the Americans, but also the French Navy. And the French would take the ideas of the American Revolution and create their own French Revolution a few years later. Picture here of the Battle of Yorktown, the surrender of Cornwallis to George Washington. The Treaty of Paris would be signed and recognize the U.S. of America as independent. This is the first time that a major colony had declared independence from a mother country and been successful. And so the American Revolution is the first of its kind to really work and be successful, and would inspire other colonies like the Haitian Revolution or the Indian Revolution or the South African Revolution to resist their oppressors. Great Britain. So results. The government under the Articles of Confederation during the war was a collection of individual states. However, they had too much individualism, too much freedom, and so the Constitutional Convention would meet to revise the Articles and frame a brand new Constitution for America. The ratification of the Constitution would be the preservation of the government with separation of powers and a Bill of Rights. That is really important. That representative government, that separation of powers, that Bill of Rights, that's the real important thing of the American Revolution. So results. What's the big idea? I want you to write this down. The revolution demonstrated influence of enlightenment, this idea of reason. It didn't make common sense, as Thomas Paine said, for America, a large colony, to be ruled by a small motherland geographically of England. The American Revolution would inspire other revolutions globally, as I mentioned, the Indian Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, French Revolution, and others. The United States of America would be recognized as an independent nation, independent from Great Britain. So you have the influence, the inspired, and the independent, the I. Important results there from the American Revolution. So we started with the absolute monarchs. People started to resist those absolute monarchs, and the American Revolution would be the crowning moment where a whole group of people start to resist another country for natural rights. Thank you for taking these notes.